In the world of specialized medicine, where the physics of the environment and the physiology of the human body intertwine in these really complex ways, absolute precision and rigorous evidence-based practice aren't just ideals. They are, well, they're the very foundation of safe and effective care. And hyperbaric medicine stands as a prime example of such a field.
Absolutely. It's a discipline with fascinating historical roots, but its evolution into a recognized and respected medical practice is actually relatively recent.
Right.
And with that recognition comes the critical need for clear definitions, stringent standards, and, a deep understanding of exactly what constitutes proven safe therapy.
And that's precisely what we're embarking on today. We're launching a deep dive into the heart of the matter, exploring key excerpts from the 15th edition of the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society Hyperbaric Medicine Indications Manual.
Ah, the big one.
Yeah. This manual, edited by Dr. Enoch T. Huang, who's got expertise in medicine, public health, and tropical medicine, it really is the authoritative source defining the landscape of evidence-based hyperbaric oxygen therapy.
It really is. And our mission today, as I understand it, is to conduct a comprehensive, detailed exploration, drawing directly from the manual's preface, background, definition, classification, utilization review, acceptance of new indication sections, plus the abbreviations and author biographies.
Yeah.
We're going like sentence by sentence, fact by fact, to unpack the history, the non-negotiable definitions, the governing standards, and the rigorous process behind this manual. This is tailored specifically for you, the specialist clinician listening, to gain an authoritative understanding straight from the source.
Think of this as peeling back the layers of the manual itself. We're not just skimming the surface, we're digging into the what and the why that define safe and effective hyperbaric medicine today. Understanding these foundational principles is, well, it's paramount. Let's start right at the beginning in the preface and trace that historical thread leading us to this 15th edition.
Okay, sounds good. The story of applying air under pressure, what was often called hyperbaric air historically, it actually stretches back much further than you might initially think, all the way to 1667.
1667, wow.
Yeah. This is when Nathaniel Henshaw first described and proposed a hypohyperbaric room using bellows to manipulate the pressure inside.
So even back in the 17th century, there was this fundamental curiosity about how altering atmospheric pressure could influence the body. That's truly foundational.
It is, and the idea of medicinal uses for oxygen itself also has deep roots, with initial reports coming from Beddoes in 1794.
Okay, so separate tracks, initially pressure and oxygen.
Right. They were initially separate concepts. The first recorded instance specifically discussing adjunctive uses of hyperbaric oxygen therapy, kind of combining the two, dates to 1879 with the work of Fontaine. He was, well, pretty innovative. He constructed a mobile operating room that could be pressurized.
A mobile pressurized operating room in 1879. That's just remarkable. The manual highlights a specific observation Fontaine made, didn't it?
It did. He noted that pressurized patients weren't as blue, cyanotic after receiving nitrous oxide anesthesia compared to those at normal atmospheric pressure.
A clinical observation hinting at a benefit? Probably better oxygen delivery?
Likely, yes. He also noted certain surgical procedures, like reducing hernias, seemed easier under pressure. Now, these were early empirical observations, certainly lacking the controlled scientific method we rely on today.
Sure, but still, interesting observations.
Definitely. However, around the same time, a crucial counterpoint emerged from the work of Paul Burt and J. Lorraine Smith.
And their contribution was vital, because they observed and reported on the potentially harmful consequences of oxygen under pressure.
Precisely. They identified side effects, including toxicity to the central nervous system and the lungs. This early recognition of oxygen toxicity is incredibly important. It reminds us that safety concerns have been inherent to this field since its nascent stages, not just a modern consideration.
That historical awareness of potential harm is crucial context for understanding the safety standards needed today. Okay, so fast forward a bit to the mid-20th century. The manual credits people like Churchill-Davidson and Boerema.
Yes, in the 1950s and 1960s, their efforts really spurred the modern scientific use of clinical hyperbaric medicine. This marked a transition towards more deliberate study and clinical application, based on a developing understanding of the physiology.
And this increased scientific interest led to formal organization.
It did. The manual tells us the Undersea Medical Society, initially known as the UMS, was founded in 1967. It was started by 6 United States naval diving and submarine medical officers.
Makes sense, given their background.
Absolutely. Their explicit initial goal was focused on promoting research and data exchange in diving and undersea medicine.
Coming from that diving and submarine background is logical, as those environments fundamentally involve compressed gases and their physiological effects. The manual notes, though, that over the years the society's interests naturally expanded.
Yeah, they broadened to include clinical hyperbaric medicine, recognizing the shared principles and, the fact that many members had interests in both areas, diving physiology and clinical therapy.
And this broader scope was formally acknowledged in 1986.
Right, that's when the society was renamed to the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society, or UHMS. The manual emphasizes that the UHMS remains the leading not-for-profit organization dedicated to reporting scientifically and medically efficacious and relevant information in both hyperbaric and undersea medicine. That renaming really solidified their commitment to clinical hyperbarics.
Okay, and the manual's own history seems tied to external pressures, too, like
Yeah.
Medicare.
Yes, in 1972, an ad hoc committee was convened by Medicare specifically to evaluate the efficacy of hyperbaric oxygen therapy to determine if it warranted coverage.
So right away you have third-party payer scrutiny influencing the need for solid evidence.
Exactly. And the manual explicitly states that its content has evolved and grown over the years, reflecting the expanding body of scientific evidence developed in the field. It's very much a living document, updated as research progresses.
And demonstrating the increasing importance of clinical applications, the Hyperbaric Oxygen Therapy Committee became a standing committee within the UMS in 1976. That formalized the ongoing review process.
It did. And the first report from the Standing Committee came out in 1977. It served as the initial guidance for practitioners and scientists. The manual notes that this report, which eventually evolved into the indications manual we have today, is typically updated every 3 to 5 years to incorporate new findings.
And a really critical point the manual makes about this document is its real-world impact. It continues to be used by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, and other third-party insurance carriers in determining payment policies.
Which gives the manual immense significance in actual clinical practice. What's listed as an accepted indication here often dictates whether a patient can actually access the treatment through their insurance.
Right.
So this 15th edition, our source today, has continued to grow in size and depth, directly reflecting the, significant evolution of the scientific literature. And the name change to manual, rather than just report, recognizes the broader scope of the specialty. It's not just about delivering oxygen under pressure anymore.
That name change signifies the maturity of the field and the multifaceted role of hyperbaric physicians today. The manual describes these physicians as evaluating complex conditions leading to ischemia and hypoxia, coordinating care with other specialists, and conducting research.
It's a role that really requires understanding the underlying medical conditions, the physiology of the compressed environment, and how to integrate hyperbaric therapy into a patient's overall care plan.
And the preface highlights a concrete example of the manual's evolution, the addition of a new indication.
Yes, osteonecrosis of the femoral head. That was added because the scientific and clinical evidence supporting it became strong enough to meet the UHMS criteria. It's a clear illustration of the evidence-based update process.
That's helpful. The manual also includes a chapter dedicated to emerging indications, right? Where HBO2 shows potential but isn't fully accepted yet.
Exactly. That chapter is valuable for researchers and clinicians interested in, what might be coming down the pike, where the field might be heading.
And reflecting the increasing sophistication, there's also a chapter on dosing, choosing specific pressures and durations.
Right, discussing the rationale and evidence behind choosing a specific dose of oxygen. It's about optimizing treatment, moving beyond just listing conditions. The manual closes this intro section by reinforcing the UHMS's reputation as the authority on medicinal oxygen, highlighting that the chapters are authored by leading experts ensuring current and accurate guidance.
And as we noted, Dr. Enoch T. Huang is the chair and editor of this 15th edition, leading the effort.
So looking back at that whole historical trajectory, from Henshaw's simple room to this incredibly detailed 15th edition manual, we see this clear movement from early sort of empirical curiosity to a rigorous evidence-based medical discipline.
Definitely.
And that history grounds us in why the precise definitions and standards we're about to dive into are so essential today.
Exactly. It's not just trivia. It's the story of how we learned what works and what doesn't, and importantly, what's safe and what isn't. Let's transition now to learn a bit more about the organization itself, the UHMS in Section 1. Background.
Okay. Section 1 provides more detail on the UHMS as an international scientific organization, reiterating its founding in 1967. Its initial focus, as we mentioned, was fostering the exchange of data on physiology and medicine relevant to commercial and military diving.
And reaffirming the preface, its interest enlarged over time to include clinical hyperbaric medicine, reflecting the evolution of the field and its members' expertise. The society boasts over 2,000 members now.
Yeah, over 2,000 members. That's a significant body of knowledge and clinical experience concentrated in one organization.
And a unique resource mentioned here is the UHMS's research repository.
Yes, it's described as the largest collection assembled in one place, covering both diving and clinical information. It's this extensive bibliographic database with thousands of scientific papers, books, technical reports, representing over 100 years of research.
Century of compiled knowledge, that's amazing. The manual specifies this collection is housed in the UHMS Schilling Library at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina.
Right. That alone underscores the depth of historical and scientific foundation available to the society. And the results of ongoing research and clinical advancements are disseminated through annual scientific meetings and the Society's journals.
Which journals were those again?
Well, the source cites the previously supported journals Undersea Biomedical Research and the Journal of Hyperbaric Medicine were merged back in 1993 into a single publication called Undersea and Hyperbaric Medicine.
Okay, so one primary journal now. And the manual gives the headquarters location, too, for practical reference.
It does. 631 U.S. Highway 1, Suite 307 in North Palm Beach, Florida. Understanding the UHMS as this international, scientifically grounded body with this vast historical archive really reinforces the authority of the manual that originates from it.
It certainly lends weight to the standards it sets. This brings us neatly to Section 2, defining the specialty of undersea and hyperbaric medicine.
Right. The manual states that in the U.S., this discipline has achieved formal recognition from two key bodies: the American Board of Emergency Medicine, ABEM, and the American Board of Preventative Medicine, ABPM.
So it's officially recognized as a subspecialty under both.
Exactly. Achieving subspecialty status is a significant milestone, signifying a recognized body of knowledge, training pathways, and the expertise required to practice. The manual explains that describing this discipline has to start with the basic scientific definition of its essential elements, building from the fundamental physics and physiology involved.
But it doesn't stop there, does it?
No, the manual quickly pivots to a crucial point for practitioners. It emphasizes that to truly understand the complexities of appropriate practice, it's equally necessary to recognize and, importantly, condemn the unfortunate proliferation of unsafe centers and unproven practices.
That's a pretty strong statement from the UHMS. It highlights a major challenge the field faces: the misuse and misrepresentation of hyperbaric therapy.
And this, the manual says, is precisely why just giving a simple physical definition isn't enough. You need these additional explanatory paragraphs. The definition of the specialty must include the distinction between appropriate evidence-based practice and inappropriate, potentially dangerous applications.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for Section 3, which gets right to the core: the definition of hyperbaric oxygen and its safe delivery. The manual states up front that this definition is complex and, unfortunately, often misrepresented.
Yeah, misrepresented to justify the use of treatments that are not proven or safe. And the manual highlights the critical role of the UHMS Hyperbaric Medicine Committee in working to clarify these misunderstandings for everyone.
How do they do that?
Well, they do this by providing an incredibly precise definition of what a session of clinical hyperbaric oxygen therapy must include according to their standards. These aren't just suggestions, they are required elements for what the UHMS considers legitimate, safe therapy. Should we walk through them?
Yes, you break it down first.
First, it must be a medical procedure requiring a physician's prescription and direct oversight. That immediately distinguishes it from any kind of non-medical use.
Okay, medical procedure, physician oversight. Second,
the patient's entire body must be placed within a hard-sided hyperbaric chamber. This is whole-body systemic treatment, not just, say, putting a bag over a limb.
got it. Whole body, hard-sided chamber. And that chamber needs specific certifications.
Absolutely crucial. The manual requires the chamber to meet the American Society of Mechanical Engineers pressure vessels for human occupancy code. That's ASME PVH01.
ASME PVH01. What does that cover?
That code governs the structural integrity and safety of chambers designed to operate under pressure with people inside. It's a vital engineering standard. Additionally, the chamber must meet the National Fire Protection Association NFPA 99 code and standards for hyperbaric chambers.
NFPA 99 for fire safety. Makes sense, given the oxygen environment. Okay, what about the pressure itself?
The manual states the treatment must be administered at a pressure of not less than 2.0 atmospheres absolute.
2.0 ATA minimum.
Right. And the manual gives the conversion, 202.65 kilopascals. This pressure threshold is fundamental to achieving the therapeutic effects, particularly getting significantly more oxygen dissolved in the plasma.
And this is while breathing.
While breathing physician-prescribed medical-grade oxygen, the source specifies this oxygen must have a purity of greater than or equal to 99.0%, meeting United States Pharmacopoeia, USP, or national equivalent standards.
99% pure medical-grade oxygen. They're very clear. That's the only acceptable gas for therapeutic delivery.
Yes, purity and medical-grade status are totally non-negotiable. And finally, duration.
Right, how long?
The manual specifies the treatment must be administered for an amount of time, typically between 90 and 120 minutes per treatment session.
Okay, 90 to 120 minutes. So let's quickly recap that precise definition from the manual. A standard, safe, effective HBO session according to UHMS needs. Physician prescription oversight, whole-body treatment in a hard-sided chamber certified to ASME PVH01 and NFPA 99, pressure of at least 2.0 ATA, 202.65 kPa. Breathing medical-grade oxygen equals 99.0% pure, and a duration typically 90 to 120 minutes. That's the blueprint.
That set of criteria is the fundamental definition provided by the UHMS, and it's what differentiates legitimate therapy from, well, other practices. The manual emphasizes that during appropriate and acceptable clinical use, oxygen functions as a drug, and its use is regulated by bodies like the FDA.
So it's treated like a prescription medication.
Essentially, yes. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy is dosed systemically by inhaling that medical-grade oxygen under increased hyperbaric pressure specifically for the diagnoses outlined in this manual.
And significantly, the manual states that this specific practice defined by these criteria is approved and managed by the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society. This manual is the basis for that approval.
Okay, let's do a quick check here, maybe like a board-style question. According to the strict definition in the UHMS manual, which of these describes a session of hyperbaric oxygen therapy? A. Patient breathes 100% O2 via mask at sea level. B. Patient in a hard-sided chamber at 1.8 ATA, breathing medical O2. C. Patient in a hard-sided chamber at 2.4 ATA, breathing medical O2 for 60 minutes. Or D. Patient in a hard-sided chamber at 2.0 ATA, breathing medical O2 for 90 minutes, prescribed by a physician.
Okay, based on what we just detailed, prescription, certified hard chamber, 2.0 ATA, high purity O2, typically 90, 120 mins only. Scenario D fully meets that UHMS definition. A is just normal baric oxygen, B is under the minimum pressure, C means pressure and gas, but it's shorter than the typical duration described.
Exactly. That precision is crucial for distinguishing effective, proven therapy. Now let's elaborate a bit on the proven application of hyperbaric oxygen therapy as described in the manual. The source notes that the most common and acceptable clinical treatment pressures actually used for the listed indications range between 2.0 ATA and 3.0 ATA.
So while 2.0 is the minimum floor for the definition, the therapeutic range usually goes up to 3.0 ATA. And the exact pressure within that range depends on the specific condition.
Right, it varies. The manual provides those guidelines for specific indications, and it assures us these pressure requirements aren't just arbitrary. They're supported by numerous publications and, years and years of clinical practice. Plus, these standards aren't set in stone. They're under constant review by the UHMS Hyperbaric Medicine Committee.
Adapting as new research comes out. What about quality assurance for facilities?
Yes, the manual mentions the UHMS Accreditation Council. This council establishes criteria for the safe and clinically appropriate delivery of HBO therapy. The FDA has even advised patients to preferentially seek out accredited facilities.
So accreditation acts as an external check that a facility meets UHMS standards for safety, staffing, protocols.
Exactly. It's a valuable marker of quality. Now, for many accepted disorders, the manual describes a typical treatment course as a series of elective treatments, usually delivered daily, often over a period spanning 4 to 8 weeks.
So for chronic things like problem wounds or maybe delayed radiation injury, it's generally a longer course of daily treatments. But emergency conditions are different.
Yes, the manual distinguishes those. Things like carbon monoxide poisoning or decompression sickness. They're treated differently, typically managed with one or maybe a few treatments over a couple of days, depending on the diagnosis and how the patient responds. Some emergencies might even need more than one treatment per day.
Shows the flexibility of the therapy regimen. And the manual clarifies the role of HBO, sometimes primary, sometimes adjunct.
Correct. In certain specific situations, it's the main treatment. In others, it's an adjunct, meaning it's used in addition to surgery or medications to improve the overall outcome.
And the manual really emphasizes the need for qualified medical oversight, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It states that all patients referred for HBO therapy should be evaluated and supervised by qualified physicians specifically trained in undersea and hyperbaric medicine, UHM.
Why is that specific training so important?
Well, that UHM training equips physicians to manage the unique aspects, the hyperbaric physiology, patient selection, contraindications, potential complications like oxygen toxicity or barotrauma, and how to integrate HBO safely and effectively with other medical or surgical care.
Makes sense. And it's not just the physicians, right? The staff, too.
Right. Complementing the physician expertise, the manual notes the importance of properly trained and ideally certified operational staff, specifically mentioning certified hyperbaric technologists, CHTs, and certified hyperbaric registered nurses, CHRNs.
Having certified staff ensures the complex technical side running the chamber, monitoring patients inside is done safely and competently, following established protocols.
Definitely. Now let's take a brief moment to touch on terminology, as the manual does in the section Hyperbaric Pressure, Understanding the Terminology. It points out that the phrase hyperbaric pressure is actually, well, redundant.
A bit redundant, yeah. Like saying ATM machine, the manual breaks down the etymology.
It does. Hyper, meaning above normal, and baric, relating to the weight or pressure of the atmosphere, with the term coined around 1880. So hyperbaric itself just means above normal atmospheric pressure.
So the manual gives a simple definition.
Yep, hyperbaric pressure can just be stated as hyperbaric, meaning any atmospheric pressure above the normal pressure found at sea level.
And normal average sea level pressure is defined as 760 millimeters of mercury, or 1 atmosphere absolute, 1 ATA. The manual gives the conversion to kilopascals as 101.325 kPa. It acknowledges that pressure varies with weather and altitude, so you need that standard reference.
Right. And the manual also lists common equivalent units you might see. 0 feet of seawater, SW, 14.7 pounds per square inch, PSI, 1 atmosphere absolute, 1 ATA, 1,013 bars, and 101.325 kilopascals. It clarifies that gauge pressure usually measures pressure above atmospheric, while absolute pressure includes atmospheric pressure.
Understanding those units and the concept of pressure relative to sea level is pretty foundational for dosing therapy accurately. Now, the manual makes a really crucial distinction by discussing hyperbaric air and its potential unsafe delivery.
Yes. While the history of pressure therapy goes way back, the manual notes that treatments using just hyperbaric air, meaning simply increasing the pressure of regular room air, didn't really have a clear medical rationale for using pressures less than 2.0 ATA for most things.
That historical context is key. Even early on, using low-pressure air lacked a strong scientific basis for broad medical use. The manual mentions historical instances, like in the 1800s, where chambers were used as medical spas.
Right, or day spas. And hyperbaric air was used for various medical and surgical conditions without credible research supporting its efficacy at that time.
And the manual points out that evidence-based medicine, as we know it, didn't really become a standard until much later.
Exactly, not until 1992 with Dr. David Sackett. So many of these historical practices, while maybe well-intentioned, weren't validated by rigorous science. The manual notes that while hyperbaric air did have a physiological basis at pressures above 2.0 ATA, think pressure itself being therapeutic for decompression sickness, it unfortunately got linked with many subjective and unproven historical treatments.
And the manual lists some conditions historically treated with hyperbaric air.
Yeah.
Things like Spanish flu, hypertension, diabetes, even syphilis, and some cancers.
Yeah, mentioning Spanish treatments specifically for cancer, the manual is very clear that these historical treatments lacked sound scientific proof of efficacy. Plus, there was added risk breathing hyperbaric air for long periods could lead to adverse effects like nitrogen narcosis or decompression sickness when you came back to normal pressure.
So this historical context of unproven practices using hyperbaric air, often at inadequate pressures, kind of sets the stage for understanding the manual's strong stance against certain modern misapplications, which leads right into one of the manual's most critical warnings. Unproven hyperbaric oxygen, often termed mild hyperbaric oxygen.
Hmm. The manual describes a concerning proliferation of facilities offering what they call mild hyperbaric therapy. You often see these in wellness centers, spas, even storefronts and shopping centers.
And the manual is pretty blunt about these centers, saying they use untested and uncertified chambers.
Extremely blunt. That lack of certification immediately raises huge safety flags. The manual explicitly highlights major risks present in these facilities: catastrophic fire risks, and the potential for loss of life due to explosive decompressions.
These aren't just theoretical worries, these are real, potentially fatal dangers with non-standard equipment in operation. The manual details the typical setup in these mild places.
Yeah, they commonly use oxygen concentrators to enrich the breathing gas mix inside the subtherapeutic pressure chamber.
Subtherapeutic, meaning below the effective pressure levels. How do they deliver the oxygen?
The manual describes these concentrators being connected to simple systems like nasal prongs or masks that the patient wears inside the chamber. But here's a critical flaw. The manual points out these delivery systems are prone to leaks.
And those leaks mean ambient air gets in.
Exactly, which results in a breathing gas mix inside the chamber that's actually well less than 100% oxygen, even if the concentrator itself is producing high concentration oxygen.
Okay, and what about regulations?
The manual addresses that directly. It states clearly that the FDA requires both the chambers and the oxygen concentrators to be cleared individually and together for legal marketing in the U.S.
But these mild centers aren't using certified chambers.
The manual emphatically states they are not using chambers that meet the essential standards of ASME PVH01 or the NFPA. This non-compliance with fundamental safety codes is a major red flag.
And the fire risk, how does that arise?
The manual explains the catastrophic fire potential. When oxygen leaks from the delivery system into the general chamber environment, it creates an oxygen-enriched atmosphere. The manual warns that when this concentration approaches 23.5% or higher, combined with the increased pressure, well, it can have potentially catastrophic results. The pressure itself enhances the intensity and speed of fire spread.
That sounds incredibly dangerous. A volatile environment.
It is. The manual also expresses concern about patients buying these types of chambers for home use without proper guidance on these potential catastrophic occurrences. That extends the safety risk into completely uncontrolled settings.
What about the treatments themselves in these mild HBO places?
The manual says they typically deliver sessions for an hour or less, often for a very wide and often unsupported spectrum of medical disorders or complaints.
And how effective are they for the proven HBO indications?
The manual is unequivocal. When the proven and accepted indications for hyperbaric oxygen therapy, the ones listed in this manual, are treated in these mild hyperbaric chambers, the treatment is inadequate and ineffective.
Not just less potent, but basically useless for stimulating healing in things like radiation injury or problem wounds.
Correct, it's insufficient. Moreover, the manual states that these mild hyperbaric centers frequently treat diagnoses for which HBO has not been found to be clinically effective or listed in this manual's accepted diagnoses list.
So they're giving inadequate treatment for conditions that do benefit from standard HBO, and they're treating conditions with no evidence of benefit from HBO at any pressure.
Precisely. The manual leaves no room for doubt. There is no credible evidence or listed support in this manual for the use of mild hyperbaric oxygen for any evidence-based medicine indication for hyperbaric oxygen therapy, as reported here.
And the potential consequences of that inadequate treatment.
They can be severe. The manual issues a stark warning. The application of mild hyperbaric therapy for the treatment of accepted indications can lead to severe disability or death of the patient.
Why? Because of inadequate treatment.
Yes, because of inadequate treatment. For example, delaying or failing to heal a critical wound by using ineffective therapy could lead to amputation or overwhelming infection, or worse.
That's a sobering thought. And beyond accepted indications.
The manual notes these mild sessions are offered for many experimental indications where there's currently no evidence-based scientific support. And it points out that this type of marketing often goes against the healthcare advertising practices regulated by both the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, and the Food and Drug Administration, FDA.
Who are the main targets for these unproven therapies?
The manual identifies particularly concerning target groups: vulnerable populations like elderly patients recovering from strokes or those with cognitive decline, as well as patients dealing with disorders like autism, cerebral palsy, post-concussive syndromes, traumatic brain injury, and even near-drowning victims with cerebral anoxia. Patients and families often desperate for solutions.
And because insurance usually doesn't cover these unproven treatments,
Patients are often left with substantial out-of-pocket expenses for treatments that are ineffective or potentially even dangerous. This whole section provides a really clear, strong warning from the UHMS, delineating legitimate, safe, effective HBO from these potentially harmful, unproven practices, often misleadingly marketed as mild HBO.
It's clear the UHMS feels very strongly about patient protection and defining the standards. Let's use the manual's own summary format here to really nail down this distinction. According to the manual, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, I as what?
Okay. It as treatment of the entire body. Treatment delivered at a pressure of 2.0 to 3.0 atmospheres absolute. It involves the inhalation of 100% oxygen at that increased pressure. Treatment sessions are typically between 90 to 120 minutes long, and it is a treatment prescribed and managed by a licensed physician.
Okay. And equally important, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, I as not.
It is not topical application of oxygen to just a limb or wound. It is not treatment at mild pressures less than 2.0 atmospheres absolute. And it is not treatment simply involving hyperbaric air.
Those points provide a really essential checklist. For anyone evaluating a hyperbaric treatment, does it meet the UHMS standard?
Absolutely.
Let's think about a scenario. You have a patient with osteoarterial necrosis, which is an accepted indication. They tell you they've been going to a local wellness spa for HBO treatments. They say it's at 1.3 ATA. They breathe oxygen from a nasal cannula inside a soft-sided chamber. What's your immediate assessment based on this manual?
Well, based strictly on the UHMS manual's definition, that patient absolutely did not receive hyperbaric oxygen therapy for their accepted indication. The treatment was totally inadequate. Pressure, way below 2.0 ATA chamber. Soft-sided, explicitly outside the ASME NFPA certified hard-sided requirement. Oxygen delivery. Nasal cannula in likely a leaky environment means they weren't breathing near 100% oxygen systemically. Duration, probably too short. Supervision, unlikely to meet UHM physician oversight standards.
So the consequence for that patient?
For a serious condition like osteoarterial necrosis, receiving this inadequate mild therapy instead of standard HBO means they've effectively gone untreated. They risk significant disability, maybe bone loss, fracture, chronic infection, worse outcomes due to delayed or absent healing. Plus, they were exposed to fire and explosion risks in an uncertified setting.
That real-world contrast powerfully illustrates why these precise definitions and warnings from the manual are so clinically vital. Okay, now let's look at the actual structures where this therapy is properly delivered. Section 4, classification of hyperbaric chambers.
Right. The manual explains that the clinical treatments described are typically given in one of two categories of chambers, Class A, which are multi-place systems, or Class B, which are monoplace chamber systems.
Let's start with Class B, the monoplace. How does that work?
The manual describes a Class B system as one where the entire chamber is pressurized with near 100% oxygen, and the patient inside breathes that ambient chamber oxygen directly. So the atmosphere they're in is the treatment gas.
Okay, one person, chamber filled with oxygen. Now Class A, multiplace.
A Class A system is different. It's a multi-place chamber, designed to hold 2 or more people at the same time. Patients, observers, maybe support staff like nurses or techs. In this system, the manual explains, the chamber is pressurized with compressed air.
With air?
Yes, compressed air. While the patients inside breathe near 100% oxygen through individual delivery systems, things like masks or special head hoods, or via endotracheal tubes if they happen to be intubated.
Ah, okay. So that allows staff to be safely inside the chamber with the patients, breathing air to avoid oxygen toxicity themselves while the patients get their therapeutic oxygen dose.
Exactly. Now, the manual does include an important note. Class B monoplace chambers can also be pressurized with compressed air while the patient breathes near 100% oxygen using a mask or hood.
So a monoplace isn't always filled with oxygen.
It's not strictly required. It can be run with air pressurization and a patient mask hood, similar to the setup in a multiplace, although, the vast majority of monoplace chambers operate with the chamber filled with 100% oxygen. The manual also briefly mentions and shows an image of a Class C animal chamber, just noting it's for animal studies, research, not human clinical use.
Got it. Bringing it back to the definition of therapy, the manual reiterates the UHMS stance, which is supported by CMS and other payers.
Yes, that breathing medical grade near 100% oxygen only at 1 atmosphere, so normobaric oxygen, or exposing only isolated body parts to 100% oxygen, topical oxygen, does not constitute hyperbaric oxygen therapy as defined by the UHMS.
Reinforcing that the key is the combination of high oxygen concentration and increased pressure applied to the entire body.
The manual is explicit. The patient must receive the oxygen by inhalation within a pressurized chamber.
And here's where the manual introduces that slight refinement on the pressure threshold we discussed earlier.
Right. It states that current information indicates that pressurization should be to 1.4 atmospheres absolute or higher for a treatment to even be considered hyperbaric oxygen therapy at all.
Okay, 1.4 ATA is the minimum floor to even use the term hyperbaric oxygen therapy.
Exactly. It provides that minimum barometric pressure, distinguishing any form of hyperbaric exposure from just normobaric therapy. But it's crucial to remember the nuance here. While 1.4 ATA is presented as the minimum threshold to technically fall under the umbrella term hyperbaric oxygen therapy based on current info.
The manual's earlier definition for safe delivery and proven clinical application for the accepted indications specifically requires not less than 2.0 ATA.
Precisely. So 1.4 ATA is the absolute lowest pressure considered hyperbaric, but 2.0 to 3.0 ATA is the pressure range demonstrated as effective for the accepted evidence-based indications listed in the manual, delivered safely in certified chambers.
That distinction is important. 1.4 ATA gets you in the category, but 2.0 ATA is the usual minimum for therapeutic effect for the conditions in this manual.
Exactly. It helps differentiate minimal experimental pressures from the therapeutically effective pressures needed for standard care.
All right, we've covered the fundamental definition, contrasted it sharply with unproven methods, described the chambers. Let's now delve into the engine behind the manual, the committee that actually reviews the evidence and establishes these standards, the Hyperbaric Oxygen Therapy Committee.
Right, now known as the Hyperbaric Medicine Committee. The manual provides some history here, tying its origins directly to those scientific studies that started appearing back in the 1930s as navies and universities worldwide began investigating oxygen breathing at elevated pressures.
Which, as we noted, links right back to the UHMS's roots in diving and submarine medicine.
Precisely. The initial main driver for those early studies was finding ways to more safely decompress divers and effectively treat decompression sickness and arterial gas embolism. The classic injuries from compressed gas exposure in diving.
And this research led to practical protocols.
It did. In the 1960s, hyperbaric oxygen therapy was formally incorporated into the standard treatment tables used by the U.S. Navy. Alongside developing treatments, extensive research was crucial to understand and manage the risks. The manual highlights that substantial research on oxygen toxicity was done during this period to establish safe exposure limits, evaluate overall safety, and really understand the complex medical and physiological aspects of the compressed gas environment.
So building the safety data was just as important.
Absolutely. These dedicated research efforts built the vast body of literature that underpins modern hyperbaric medicine. Recognizing the growing number of clinical applications beyond diving and the need for rigorous review, the Executive Committee of the UHMS established the Hyperbaric Oxygen Therapy Committee back in 1976.
So this committee has been the steward of evidence review for almost 50 years now. Its core responsibility.
Continuously reviewing incoming research and clinical data and then rendering recommendations regarding the clinical efficacy and safety of hyperbaric oxygen therapy for various conditions.
And to ensure a comprehensive review, the manual highlights the committee's composition.
Yes, it's a multi-specialty committee. It comprises practitioners and scientific investigators from a really wide range of diverse medical fields. The manual actually lists them: internal medicine, infectious diseases, pharmacology, emergency medicine, general surgery, orthopedic surgery, trauma surgery, thoracic surgery, otolaryngology, oral and maxillofacial surgery, anesthesiology, pulmonology, critical care, radiation oncology, and aerospace medicine.
Wow, that's an extensive list. It really shows the UHMS recognizes the systemic effects of HBO and the need for input from specialties whose patients might benefit or whose conditions intersect with the therapy, ensures a holistic review.
Definitely. And the manual states the committee meets annually to conduct its review of research and clinical data. Looking at the evolution of the manual's content, the source notes the history of accepted indications. It started with 28 conditions recommended for reimbursement in the 76 and 79 reports.
Yeah, now it's refined down to 15 in the current edition.
Right. That refinement reflects the changing evidence landscape over time. The manual explicitly states these 15 indications are those for which the preclinical research data, both in vitro and in vivo, and extensive positive clinical experience and study have become convincing.
Convincing is the key word there. Implies a high standard of proof. Which brings us to the specific evidence requirements for indications section. How high is that bar?
It's very high. The manual outlines a stringent requirement set by the committee. Experimental and clinical evidence submitted for the efficacy of HBO treatment for a disorder must be at least as convincing as the evidence supporting any other currently accepted standard treatment modality for that same disorder.
So HBO isn't judged against some lower standard. Its evidence has to hold up against established therapies for the same condition.
Exactly. And the manual adds that even for accepted indications, research is always ongoing to clarify things like mechanisms of action, optimal oxygen dosage, pressure, duration, ideal treatment frequency, and patient selection criteria. The science is always evolving.
That ongoing research is vital for optimizing existing treatments. The manual reiterates the direct link between the committee's findings and clinical practice accessibility.
Yes. The committee recommends third-party reimbursement for the disorders included in that accepted indications category, and the manual notes the current positive status with payers. Most insurance carriers currently base their HBO reimbursement policies on these UHMS recommendations, shows the trust placed in the committee's rigorous review.
Okay, beyond clinical outcomes, the committee also looks at cost effectiveness.
They do, and the findings reported in the manual are significant. Results show that in addition to its clinical efficacy, HBO therapy can yield direct cost savings.
How so?
By successfully resolving a high percentage of complex, difficult, and often expensive disorders, thereby minimizing the need for prolonged hospitalization or managing chronic complications down the road.
That finding adds an important economic layer to the value proposition of appropriate HBO therapy. Now, regarding how facilities determine their charges,
The manual clarifies that the committee recommends each individual hyperbaric facility, whether it's monoplace or multiplace, establish its own charges. These charges should be consistent with the actual local costs incurred in providing the service, allows for regional variation.
okay, let's move to Section 5. Utilization Review. This provides guidance on managing treatment courses after therapy is initiated for an accepted indication, right?
Yes. It states that a utilization review section is included for each recognized HBO indication within the manual, giving specific guidance for that condition.
And utilization review is specifically recommended if the number of treatments needed looks like it might exceed the typical number recommended for that indication, a check against potentially unnecessary prolonged treatment.
Exactly. The manual outlines the process for this review. It should involve discussing the clinical case with another qualified hyperbaric medicine physician, ideally one from an outside institution.
So, a peer review mechanism for an external expert opinion on extending treatment.
Right. And the manual states the outcome. If that outside hyperbaric physician agrees, based on the clinical situation, that additional HBO treatments are warranted, then treatment may exceed the usually prescribed number. It builds in flexibility for complex cases, but maintains expert consensus and oversight.
It's a structured way to manage deviations from standard protocols, making sure decisions to extend expensive therapy are well supported. We've now traced the history, defined accepted therapy versus the dangers, looked at chambers, reviewed the committee's role, its evidence standards, cost effectiveness, utilization review. Let's see how the manual actually incorporates new knowledge and adds new indications. That's Section 6, Acceptance. Addition of new indications.
Okay. The manual details a rigorous process for considering potential new indications for acceptance. This process culminates at the meeting of the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medicine Committee, which happens during the UHMS annual meeting.
And where do these considerations come from? Can anyone propose one?
Well, consideration can originate internally from within the committee itself, or it can be initiated by a written request submitted by a non-committee member, maybe a clinician or researcher who believes they have compelling evidence for a new use.
Okay, so if a new indication is formally considered, what happens next?
A comprehensive application is completed. This application has to summarize all the available evidence, in vitro data, in vivo, animal studies, and human clinical trial data relevant to this potential new indication for HBO therapy.
So a full evidence dossier,
Yeah.
and then it goes to the committee.
Yes, but it undergoes a very structured review. The manual states the application is presented, and critically, a committee member is specifically selected and tasked with presenting counter-arguments to accepting the new indication.
So they build in a devil's advocate role.
Essentially, yes. It's not just a presentation of supporting evidence, it's a deliberate process of challenging the evidence and the rationale. That built-in skepticism is vital for maintaining rigor.
Makes sense. So how does the final debate and decision happen?
The manual explains that at the annual scientific meeting of the UHMS, both the petitioner's arguments, the case for the new indication, and the opposition's arguments, the counterpoints and challenges, are presented to the full Hyperbaric Medicine Committee for discussion and evaluation.
And the decision requires
It's demanding. The manual states that a consensus of the Hyperbaric Medicine Committee is required to recommend that the indication be moved into the accepted category, not a simple majority vote. It demands broad agreement among that diverse group of experts.
Achieving consensus among experts from different fields must mean the evidence has to be truly compelling and withstand some serious scrutiny. What's the final step if they do reach consensus?
If the committee recommends acceptance, that recommendation then goes to the executive committee of the society. The executive committee holds the final vote on whether or not to officially recognize the new indication and include it in the manual.
Wow, so it's multi-layered, peer-reviewed, consensus-driven application, internal challenge, public debate, votes at 2 levels. That process, as described, really underscores the high bar for adding anything new to this authoritative document. It's like a verbal algorithm, ensuring only robustly supported indications get in.
It absolutely is. It's a deliberate process designed to protect the manual's integrity and ensure its recommendations stay grounded in the strongest available evidence, maintaining its status as the definitive guide for evidence-based hyperbaric medicine.
Okay, briefly covering the final sections mentioned. Section 7 is the list of abbreviations. The manual notes this section defines the numerous abbreviations used.
Right. And as we've aimed for depth and clarity in our deep dive here, we've consistently used the full terms and phrases whenever abbreviations came up in the source, explaining concepts fully for you, the listener, rather than relying on acronyms. But that section would be a handy quick reference for clinicians using the actual manual.
Definitely. And finally, Section 8 covers the author biographies. The manual lists the individuals who authored the various chapters and sections.
And reviewing those bios is actually really valuable. It provides context for the sheer depth and breadth of expertise that contributed to this manual. You see the diverse specialties, the affiliations leaders in diving medicine, wound care, emergency medicine, surgery, radiation oncology, research, so many fields.
Seeing the credentials and backgrounds of the contributors just reinforces the manual's authority, and the multidisciplinary expertise behind its recommendations adds another layer of confidence in the information.
So maybe let's try and synthesize the major themes, the key takeaways from our detailed exploration of these foundational sections of the UHMS Hyperbaric Medicine Indications Manual.
Okay. We've journeyed from the earliest historical curiosity about pressure and oxygen, acknowledging the critical lessons learned about both potential benefits and serious risks, all the way to the establishment of modern science-based hyperbaric medicine.
We delved into the UHMS itself, understanding it as this leading international scientific society, deep roots in diving medicine, that huge research repository, formal subspecialty recognition, and a very clear mission to define and promote evidence-based hyperbaric practice.
We spent significant time on the absolute cornerstone, that precise definition of accepted hyperbaric oxygen therapy. We detailed all those non-negotiable requirements for a treatment session physician-prescribed, whole body in a certified hard-sided chamber, 2.0 ATA, high-purity medical O2, 90, 120 minutes.
And in stark contrast, we explored the manual's really strong condemnation of unproven practices, particularly what's often termed mild hyperbaric oxygen therapy. We highlighted the critical dangers with those facilities, uncertified equipment, inadequate pressures for accepted indications, compromised oxygen delivery, lack of evidence for the conditions they treat, and exposing vulnerable patients to serious risks like fire, explosive decompression, inadequate treatment leading to severe outcomes, plus that significant financial burden for ineffective therapy.
We looked at the classifications of safe clinical chambers, Class A multiplace and Class B monoplace, and clarified that difference between the 1.4 ATA minimum threshold for something to technically be called HBO and the 2.0 ATA minimum that's standard for the proven effective treatments listed in the manual.
And we unpacked that rigorous, evidence-based process managed by the Multi-Specialty Hyperbaric Medicine Committee. We saw how they require evidence for HBO to be as convincing as for other standard therapies, how they review cost-effectiveness, provide for utilization review and extending treatment, and employ that multi-stage, consensus-driven process for accepting new indications into the manual, ensuring the document evolves based only on robust data.
Understanding these foundational elements straight from the manual, the precise definitions, the safety standards, the evidence requirements, the regulatory context, the process for establishing indications, it feels absolutely fundamental for any specialist clinician involved in, or even just considering hyperbaric medicine for their patients. It's not just about knowing which conditions are listed, it's about understanding what the therapy truly is, how it must be safely delivered, and why only treatments meeting these rigorous standards are considered evidence-based and effective. It gives you that critical framework for distinguishing legitimate, potentially life-saving treatment from harmful, unproven practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And as the science continues to advance, as new research emerges, the UHMS's ongoing work to review, refine, and determine acceptance of new indications remains vital. Navigating that complex landscape of potential new applications while strictly upholding the high standards of evidence and patient safety defined right here in this manual, that's the ongoing challenge that shapes the future of this field.
And thinking about this deeply structured approach, how an authoritative body defines a complex medical therapy, sets stringent standards for its safe delivery, demands rigorous evidence for its indications, and uses this multi-layered, consensus-driven process for validation. What insights does this model offer for how you, the listener, might evaluate other emerging therapies or technologies in your own practice, regardless of your specific specialty?
That's a great question. I think it really underscores the importance of looking beyond just anecdotal reports or, slick promotional claims. Instead, demanding clarity on the precise nature of the intervention, the validation of the equipment used, the quality and breadth of the actual evidence supporting its use for a specific condition, and crucially, the presence of oversight from recognized, unbiased expert bodies.
A crucial lens to apply in really any area of medicine today.